I've always been the kind of person who minds their own business. You do your thing, I do mine. And as long as no one is harming anyone, the world turns just fine. I'd lived in my little corner of the neighborhood for 13 years by the time the new neighbors arrived. My house wasn't much to look at compared to some of the newer, flashier places popping up in town. But it was mine. Solid stone walls, a vegetable garden I'd been tending since the early 2010s, and a chicken coop tucked in the back that kept me in fresh eggs year-round. It was peaceful here. The neighborhood itself was nothing special at first glance. Tree-lined streets, quiet cul-de-sacs, the occasional barking dog, or the distant hum of a lawnmower on Sunday afternoons. Most of us had been here long enough to know each other's routines, even if we weren't all best friends. Mrs. Caldwell from 3 houses down would always wave when she saw me out front. Old Mr. Hughes would wander over sometimes, leaning on his cane to tell me about the weather forecast as if I didn't already know. I liked it that way. Low drama, predictable. The property to my north had been empty for almost a year before it sold. The previous owners, the Bentleys, had been good people, quiet, tidy, always ready to lend a hand if you needed one. When they decided to downsize and move closer to their grandchildren, I was sad to see them go, but I understood. After they left, the place sat on the market for months. I figured whoever bought it would probably be another family like them. Someone looking for peace, not trouble. I couldn't have been more wrong. They arrived in early April of last year, right when the last frost was melting, and the first buds were appearing on my apple tree. I remember the day the moving trucks pulled up. 2 massive vans with a local company's logo plastered on the side. Out stepped a couple who looked like they'd been plucked straight out of a home improvement magazine photo shoot. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a polo shirt and mirrored sunglasses even though it was barely 8 in the morning. She had perfectly straight blonde hair, not a strand out of place, and a look on her face like she was already mentally rearranging the neighborhood to fit her vision. At first I was polite. I walked over, introduced myself, and welcomed them. They barely smiled. The man, his name was Eric, gave me a quick nod, while the woman, Samantha, looked me up and down in a way that made me feel like she was appraising an outdated piece of furniture. They said something about how they'd been looking for a property with more potential, and that this place was a fixer-upper with great bones. I didn't think much of it at the time. People move in with big dreams all the time. The first real sign that they were going to be different came a few weeks later. Without so much as a heads up, they had a crew come in and start cutting down the row of old trees that had stood between our properties for decades. They were tall, graceful things, oaks mostly, that had grown long before either of our houses had been built. They'd always been part of the neighborhood's character, casting cool shade in the summer and filtering the late afternoon sun. When I asked, Eric said the trees were blocking all the sun from their property. He said it like it was an obvious crime, as if the trees had been deliberately conspiring against them. I wanted to tell him that was nonsense, that the sun moved, that they'd still have plenty of light, but I bit my tongue. It was their property, their decision, and so I let it go. The tree removal left their side looking bare and exposed, like someone had shaved a patch of their scalp. I could suddenly see straight into their backyard from mine. But still, I told myself, this wasn't my problem. Then came the fence. One morning in early summer, I woke up to the sound of drilling and hammering. When I stepped outside, I saw workers putting up a towering gabion fence right along the property line. I knew the local ordinances allowed for a maximum height of 2 meters, but theirs was easily 2.5. I measured it later just to be sure. 2.50 meters exactly. Technically, I could have reported it, but since their house sat to the north of mine, it wasn't going to block any of my sunlight, and I wasn't in the mood to start a feud over 0.5 meter of fence. So once again I let it go. By late summer, they'd planted 2 young ornamental trees about 1 meter from the border between our yards. Local rules said you had to keep a 2 to 3 meter distance for certain species, but these were well inside that line. I noticed, I made a mental note, and I moved on. Then they put up a garden shed, directly on the border. No clearance at all. I don't know if they thought they were being clever, or if they simply didn't care about the rules, but I could practically lean over from my side and touch the thing. Again, technically a violation. Again I kept quiet. Some people might think I was being too lenient, that I should have stood my ground from the start. Maybe they're right, but I've always believed in picking my battles. A few minor violations weren't worth losing my peace over. But then, 3 days ago, they crossed a line I couldn't ignore. It was a Tuesday morning, just after breakfast. I was outside feeding my chickens when Samantha appeared at the fence, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Eric stood a few paces behind her, looking smug. Without so much as a hello, she launched into a tirade about my stone wall, the one that had stood at the front of my property since before I bought the place. She called it ugly and old and said it was dragging down the look of the neighborhood. She actually demanded, that I knock it down and replace it with something more modern. Her tone was sharp, her words clipped, like she expected me to just agree and get to work that afternoon. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I liked my wall just fine. It had character, it had history. That's when Eric chimed in, yelling about my rooster and my hens, saying they were noisy and unsanitary. He even had the nerve to say, "Nobody wants to hear barnyard animals when they're trying to enjoy their backyard." I saw red. I told them, well, let's just say I suggested in no uncertain terms, that they might be happier if they moved back to the city they came from, or better yet, back into the hole they'd crawled out of. And then I turned and walked away before I said something even worse. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about all the little things I'd let slide, about how they'd taken advantage of my silence. I thought about calling a lawyer, having all their non-compliant structures torn down. It wouldn't cost me a thing, just a bit of paperwork and time. But then, late that night, an idea came to me. Something better, something that would get under their skin in a way they couldn't do a damn thing about. The morning after that confrontation, I woke up with a tight knot in my stomach. I lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word that had been said between me and Samantha and Eric. Even in the quiet darkness, their voices echoed sharp, hostile, dismissive. I kept turning it over in my mind, wondering if I had been too harsh, or maybe not harsh enough. That rooster of mine, the damn bird, was a symbol of everything I'd built here over the years. And the stone wall was more than just bricks piled on top of each other. It was part of my story. A story they had no right to rewrite. It wasn't just about property lines or fences anymore. It was about respect, or the absolute lack of it. As I lay there, the resentment bubbled up inside me, growing hotter and more focused. I knew I could take the legal route, sure. But the idea of dragging this out in court, dealing with lawyers, inspectors, and endless back and forth, none of it felt satisfying. No, I wanted something more, something that would leave a mark, something that would make them think twice before coming at me with their demands again. The plan came to me slowly, almost innocuously. I remembered the garden rules about clearance distances. They had planted their trees about a meter from the border, well inside the allowed buffer zone. They'd pushed their luck already. What if I did the same? What if I pushed it even further? I did a bit of research on fast-growing trees, the kind that would thrive in our climate, and grow tall quickly enough to block sunlight. And that was when I stumbled on Paulownia tomentosa, also called princess or empress trees. These beauties were known for their rapid growth, sometimes 4 meters a year, under the right conditions. They could easily grow 25 meters tall if left unchecked. I could picture it already. 4 tall, imposing trees planted just inside my property line, close enough to the fence that they'd overshadow their backyard for hours every day. The irony would be delicious. After all, they'd been so quick to cut down the old trees that blocked their sun, and now I would give them something they couldn't just chop down without legal trouble. There was a sweet satisfaction in knowing I'd be using the very rules they'd bent to their advantage against them. I got out of bed and went straight to my computer. I placed an order for 4 Paulownia saplings, each about 2.5 meters tall already. No waiting around for seeds to sprout. They'd be delivered in a few days, ready to plant. I even found a local nursery that guaranteed the trees were healthy and fast-growing. It felt like the first spark of control I'd had since they moved in. Planting those trees wasn't just about blocking sunlight. It was about reclaiming my space, my peace, my dignity. I was tired of feeling bullied and dismissed by strangers who seemed to think they owned the whole neighborhood. I imagined Samantha's face when she saw the trees grow, taller and taller, casting shadows over her pristine garden. Eric pacing in frustration as the sun disappeared earlier each afternoon. I laughed to myself at the thought, but I also knew this wasn't just about revenge. Deep down I wanted my property to feel like home again. A place where I wasn't constantly second-guessing every stone I set or every chicken I fed. The weeks that followed were a mix of quiet anticipation and restless nights. I planted the saplings carefully along the border, just as close as I could without risking a legal complaint from their side. Each day, I watered them, trimmed them, whispered little hopes that they'd grow strong and fast. Meanwhile, Eric and Samantha continued with their usual antics. I overheard them complaining about that ugly stone wall to other neighbors, their voices dripping with entitlement. They invited friends over, flaunting their so-called modern lifestyle, ignoring the simmering tension under the surface. One afternoon, Samantha stormed out with a measuring tape, scrutinizing the placement of my trees and muttering about property disputes and neighborhood standards. She even threatened to call the council, but after a quick phone call, she found out I was fully within my rights. That only fueled my quiet satisfaction. The other neighbors started taking notice too. Some gave me sympathetic nods, others whispered about the new drama on the street, but nobody dared cross me. Inside though, I was a mess sometimes. It wasn't easy carrying this simmering anger day after day. I felt isolated, even a little paranoid. Would they try to damage my trees? Would they escalate things to violence? The anxiety gnawed at me during the quiet moments. Yet, there was something freeing about standing up for myself in a way that didn't involve shouting or giving in. At night, when the street was silent, and the moonlight cast long shadows across my garden, I found myself talking to the trees. I told them they were my sentinels, my quiet army standing watch against those who thought they could steamroll over me. The sun still shone on my property, the birds still sang. My chickens clucked contentedly, and slowly, inch by inch my little forest began to grow. After planting those trees, I thought I'd feel a sense of calm, maybe even victory. But instead, I found myself stuck in a storm of mixed emotions I hadn't quite expected. The days blurred together, mornings spent tending to the saplings, afternoons trying to focus on work, evenings filled with restless thoughts that refused to quiet down. It was like carrying a weight in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe sometimes. The trees were growing, sure, but so was the tension. Eric and Samantha weren't about to let this go. They started showing up at my fence more often, their faces tight with frustration. Sometimes I'd catch Samantha glaring as she snapped pictures of the trees on her phone, muttering about property laws and getting a lawyer. Eric was more subtle but no less hostile. I spotted him staring from behind the windows, his jaw clenched as he paced their backyard like a caged animal. Their subtle provocations seeped into every corner of my life. One evening, I found the gate to my chicken coop left open, the hens scattered and frightened. I was pretty sure it wasn't an accident. The next morning, someone had dumped a bag of fertilizer on my vegetable patch, too little to kill the plants, but enough to stunt their growth. My neighbors began whispering too. Mrs. Caldwell, always sweet, told me she'd seen Eric complaining loudly at the local hardware store about me making things difficult. Mr. Hughes warned me to keep an eye on my property, his voice low and serious. It felt like I was caught in a war I hadn't wanted to start but now had no choice but to fight. At work, I couldn't shake the tension. My mind kept drifting back to the house next door, to the stone wall, the fence, the trees. I found myself snapping at colleagues over minor things, losing focus on projects I'd normally ace. The stress started eating into my sleep, and the exhaustion made everything harder. Worse still, my family felt the strain. My partner noticed the change first. She'd ask gently if I was okay, if something was wrong, but I brushed her off. I didn't want to burden her with my petty neighborhood squabble, but the frustration leaked out, gritted teeth, a sour mood at dinner, silence when I should have been present. I even caught myself wondering if it was worth it. Was I turning into the kind of person I hated? The kind who let anger and grudges dictate their life? The kind who fought for territory like a dog with a bone, even if it meant losing pieces of themselves? One afternoon, I sat on my porch with a beer, staring at the fence and the young trees, and felt tears sting the corners of my eyes. It wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about feeling invaded, disrespected, powerless. And yet, I was standing my ground. Somehow, that made it hurt even more. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Some neighbors took Eric and Samantha's side, impressed by their modern taste and quick actions. Others sympathized with me, recognizing that slow-burning tensions that rarely made headlines were often the hardest to endure. I started documenting everything. The damage to my property, the confrontations at the fence, the threats overheard at the hardware store. I knew if things escalated further, I'd have proof, but I hoped it wouldn't come to that. At the same time, I found unexpected moments of solace in the very trees I'd planted as my quiet retaliation. Watching their leaves catch the sunlight, hearing the soft rustle in the breeze, reminded me of resilience. They were stubborn, unyielding, growing despite everything, and maybe, so was I. The tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to cut with a knife, but I could feel something else growing inside me too. A quiet determination, fueled by every sneer, every insult, every passive-aggressive jab from Eric and Samantha. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about reclaiming my sense of self, my right to live in peace on my own land. I started paying closer attention to every detail around the property line, mapping out exactly where the boundaries lay, and making sure my new trees were well within the legal limit. I wasn't going to give them any ammo. If they wanted to pick a fight, I would meet them on my terms. Precise, prepared, and unshakable. Planting those paulownias was an act of rebellion, yes, but also one of hope. They were my slow-growing guardians, proof that sometimes, the best revenge isn't immediate destruction but steady, undeniable presence. With every day the trees shot higher, casting wider shadows, whispering promises of shade and shelter. I watered them carefully, talked to them like old friends. I knew they'd be the reason Eric and Samantha lost the sunlight they'd coveted so much. Of course, I didn't expect things to stay peaceful. Samantha showed up more than once with complaints and threats, but the local council had already sided with me on every issue. I kept my cool, responding with calm firmness and copies of property laws. Meanwhile, the rumors about the escalating feud trickled through the neighborhood grapevine like wildfire. I could tell some neighbors admired my quiet strength. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the growing drama. My partner stuck by me, her steady presence a balm when the stress threatened to overwhelm. Sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake wondering if this was the hill I wanted to die on. Was I becoming bitter? Would it ever end? But each time I looked out the window and saw those young trees standing tall, I knew I was fighting for something real. The sun might still shine on my own property, but soon, it would fade behind those leaves for them. A little poetic justice for their arrogance. I even started imagining the day when the shade would be so thick they'd complain about losing sunlight to their precious trees. How would they react when their own impatience and disregard for the rules turned against them? Would they learn respect, or would this spark a new level of spite? Part of me felt sorry for them. Maybe they were just insecure people desperate to make their mark on the world, but they went about it the wrong way. I understood that sometimes, change was hard, and people reacted with fear or anger. Still, I refused to let that fear control me. Instead, I chose to take back my space, quietly but firmly. The trees were my allies now, growing day by day, their roots digging deep into the soil like my own resolve. There was a strange satisfaction in that, like I'd turned the tables without ever having to raise my voice again. Years passed. The trees grew taller than I ever imagined, their branches stretching wide, their leaves thick and lush. What started as a quiet act of defiance had blossomed into a living monument, a natural barrier that not only cast long shadows over Eric and Samantha's yard, but also stood as a reminder of patience and persistence. The sun they once chased, the light they so desperately wanted, faded behind those trees. By the second summer, the shade stretched across their garden by mid-morning. By the third year, their prized flower beds wilted in the dimness, and their voices grew quieter as they retreated indoors, begrudgingly accepting their new reality. They never tore the trees down, nor could they, not without facing legal trouble over the boundary laws they had already violated themselves. The neighborhood watched in a mixture of amusement and admiration as the silent war played out, quietly, steadily, without a single shouted insult or public fight. For me, those years brought unexpected clarity. The anger that once simmered inside me gave way to a calm acceptance. I realized that this wasn't just about property lines or petty disputes. It was about standing up for what's yours, about protecting your home and dignity, but also about understanding that peace isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about growing beyond them. My partner and I planted a small garden beneath those towering trees, a place where the past and present intertwined. I rebuilt parts of the old stone wall, restoring its weathered charm. The chickens still clucked happily in the coop, and the neighborhood felt, for the most part, like home again. Eric and Samantha eventually moved away, unable to adjust to the shade, both literal and figurative, that had crept into their lives. I heard through the grapevine that they moved back to the city, trading their dream fixer-upper for something more predictable and less complicated. Sometimes I wonder if they ever realized how their impatience and lack of respect led to their own downfall. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. It doesn't really matter anymore. What matters is that I found a way to stand my ground without losing myself. I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't instant, but slow and steady, like the growth of a tree reaching for the sky, unyielding and unstoppable. And in the end, that was enough.